Chapter 2. I'm telling you the truth, Dawn repeated herself after the trio had settled into the squat. The windows were boarded up, save for a few planks of wood that had been removed and allowed a street light to filter into the place. The residence was one that had been abandoned, and from the scattered cans and newspapers she knew the two boys had turned it into a temporary home. She sat on a well-worn sofa, and the two men stood before her. Ricky had threatened her when they had arrived, and Mike showed concern. She hadn't been lying, though. She was telling the truth when she said she could sense danger. Ricky saw it as nothing more than smoke and mirrors. I come from Oakwood House, she told them again. She sat further back on a sofa that had seen better days. Ricky stared down at her from where he stood. Mike sat at the other side of the three-seated furniture.
I'm not listening to your shit anymore. You're an attention seeker.
Ricky finally spoke up.
Ricky, what's up?
Mike asked his friend directly.
Do you know the place or something? You may just burn the newspapers, but I read the articles sometimes.
Ricky turned his back to them both.
It was all over the papers 3 days ago. Arson at Oakwood House. 42 bodies and no survivors.
The room fell silent. Dawn stared at her feet. She could feel Mike's eyes on her.
You're sure you're from there?
Mike trembled. She nodded slowly, tears welling. All of the people she had grown up with were gone. They were dead. She sat within the dim room, a well-worn blanket around her shoulders, and a can of opened beans she had been slowly consuming still in her left hand.
But that's hundreds of miles away. You barely look a teenager. How on earth? Why? Just why?
Mike asked her. I just kept running. I can sense danger. You know I can, and you witnessed it. Something bigger than that was coming to Oakwood House. Much bigger. I tried to warn them, but She began to stammer out. She remembered back to the number of foster parents she had been with. She'd been passed back and forth between children's homes and different couples. The last family she'd been with was over 2 years ago, before they realized that looking after her would cost too much to carry on. She had lived at Oakwood House since then, the longest she had stayed in one place. Everyone there was supposed to be her family, but instead they only seemed to tolerate her. Even so, she didn't want them coming to harm. Danger was coming. She knew it was coming. She begged them to leave the old building for a while. Then they would all be safe. They tried to encourage her, to convince her that it was simply her overactive imagination, that the sooner they got her to a foster family, the better. She remembered she had begged them to listen. She begged them to leave, but they locked her in her room and told her she could come out when she'd realized she was being silly. As the day had gone by, her senses became worse and worse. She had fled from Oakwood House. She knew she had to leave, but could not truly explain why. She'd been having the dream, and episodes of heat, and noises bouncing in her head, and for her, that was enough. She grabbed everything from her room that she could. All of the money she had saved, sweets and snacks and an empty bottle. She'd smashed the bedroom window of a chair and had left. She ran first, then walked, and kept walking, following the sun until it was night. During the night she'd continue to walk, looking at signs, heading towards the next town. When the sun rose, she walked away from it. When it was past noon, she followed it. Her legs cramped, her throat dried, and her food was soon depleted. She'd poured water into her bottle from puddles, and the contents had made her feel sick. She felt drained from the journey. Despite all this, she never allowed herself to sleep. It was too risky. It was too risky, because every step she took, she knew danger was also taking a step towards her. The last day she could barely remember. Mike stared at the young girl who he had rescued from the cold of the night, a girl who had been travelling for days. Her clothes were muddy and discoloured, but not to the extent that they were well worn like his. Her features were thin but not aged. But this had been her only hardship. She must have been running non-stop. But why? Could she really sense when things were going to go wrong?
A word, Mike.
Ricky broke the silence as he walked out of the room. Mike pulled himself from the sofa as Dawn watched him. He gave her a weak smile before leaving the supposed lounge, stepping into the deteriorating kitchen. Is it possible? Mike asked Ricky as he took a swig of water for himself.
It said no survivors,
Ricky commented.
But it also said not all the bones are recovered. It is possible she'd run away before it burnt down. Sensing it was going to happen, though, is bullshit.
Mike pulled a rusted garden chair from a well-used table and sat down, looking up at his friend.
I believe her, Ricky,
Mike insisted. His friend gave a grunt in response. Ricky did not trust things easily, not without exact proof. He was a hardened man that looked out only for himself and for Mike. Mike was the only person he had ever shown consideration for as far as his friend was aware. Let her stay here tonight, Mike insisted. He didn't want her to go back out in the streets, whether her senses were real or fake.
She's too good for this place, and we definitely can't support her. Can barely feed ourselves.
Ricky spoke as he sat at the other side of the table.
She's got nowhere to go, Mike replied. That's not on us. I reckon a sod burnt it down and fled the scene. Take her to the police tomorrow. They'll still put her up. There's got to be other children's homes. Seriously, could it be worse than this place?
Mike never liked confrontation. It was for that reason the two seemed to work well. With Ricky's hardened expression, it was rare for the two to face confrontation. That prevented him from being able to beg. Mike's sweet and careful personality enabled him to pull off begging directly, but because of that, he tended to be a target. The two worked together on the streets. Their friendship had been invaluable to each other. For one, I'm sure she didn't burn it down, Mike defended her as Ricky scoffed in response. But you are right. I'd best go to the police tomorrow with her and ask what to do. Could I get done for kidnap? Mike questioned, gazing down at his hand. You didn't kidnap her, Mike. Gosh, you're making it your own troubles. You know that. As soon as the morning comes, take her to the police. They'll sort out the arsonist, Ricky told his friend. Ricky worried about his friend. Kindness was not rewarded on the streets. You had to look after number one. That was all you could afford to look after. I didn't know there would be a fire, Dawn interrupted their conversation. The two men looked over at her as she stepped into the kitchen. She did not look directly at them as she placed the empty can at the side of the sink. I don't understand why or how, but I knew so it was coming. Ricky shook his head, turned away from her, and snatched the bottled water from his friend. Mike looked up at her with concern. I've been calling it common sense, she tried to explain directly to him. It's common sense when, say, you know it's dangerous, so you back away from it, right? She asked. Not really. I mean, you instinctively know that, I really don't know how to explain it, Mike confessed. Dawn slowly approached the table. Mike pulled out the third and final chair, and she sat herself next to him. I can try and explain, she continued. I was standing on the edge of a cliff a week back. My mind jumped and began to scream to me that something was very wrong, so I went back to the house. Not an actual scream, Mike interrupted her. It sounded like a real scream in my mind. It felt real enough, she told him in a matter-of-fact tone. But the screaming didn't go away. Voices in her head, you found a real nutcase, Ricky sneered. Mike glared over at his friend. Ricky ignored his gaze, though, as he took another chug of water. I asked my roommate what it was, and she said it was common sense. It's telling me to get away from the cliff. She made a joke about how no one has common sense these days, and that is quite uncommon. It got worse and worse as hours went by, Dawn continued, noticing Mike was staring at her strangely, his face pulled in awkwardness. She felt upset. He was just like the others. They didn't believe. I knew something was going to happen, but nobody listened to me, she accentuated. Do you hear the crap that is coming from your mouth? Ricky asked her directly. I tried to warn you both back there that we shouldn't have gone down that way, she cut in, becoming frustrated with Ricky's sarcasm and stabs. I tried to warn them too, you know. I tried, but they didn't listen. Ricky rose from his chair sharply, glaring at the young girl. She looked up at him, unflinching at his sudden stand.
Please don't, Mike tried to cut between them, turning to Dawn. I'm listening, okay?
Dawn gave a weak smile and a slight nod, turning her attention away from his friend. Ricky slowly sat back down, his fingers clenching into a fist on the table. The girl had no fear of him, and that in itself unnerved him. She was either stupid or telling the truth. It was a few days ago that the screaming in my head became unbearable, she continued to explain to both of them. I knew then that... Her words trailed off. She couldn't bring herself to finish her sentence.
Whatever you felt before, do you feel it now?
Ricky asked her directly. Mike looked up at him in surprise. It had been a genuine question, the first. No, it's so peaceful now, like someone has turned a switch off, she told him.
You better stay here. Sleep through the rest of tonight. Sleep through the day if you have to.
Ricky finally presented his decision.
We'll figure this out tomorrow.
Thank you. Perhaps she was quick to trust the two men, but she felt she had very little options. She still felt ill from travelling non-stop with little food, water, and no sleep.
Mike likes to drag in strays, feels sorry for people,
Ricky explained.
Besides, I know a kid like you isn't going to be staying around for long.
What do you mean? Mike asked indirectly. Dawn knew what he meant, fully understood that this would be only temporary. She intended it to be that way.
We'll talk later, mate.
Ricky pushed the topic to one side. He pulled a can of beans on one side and opened it with the blade he'd originally threatened Dawn with. Mike swallowed hard and stood up from the table, took her hand and led her back to the sofa. There was no protesting as she fell to the sofa and immediately lay on it. For a while Mike stared at Dawn. He could see that she was starting to drift off, still not fully over her ordeal.
Dawn, when you were out there, you were tossing and turning in your sleep. Was that to do with your common sense?
Mike sat on the floor next to her. She stared at her fingers for a while. She didn't want to recall the nightmares that haunted her at nights and remained in her mind during the day. For a moment she closed her eyes. He deserved to know, no matter how far-fetched it seemed. I'll explain, but you need to have an open mind, she cautioned him. He paused for a moment before nodding. She started to explain. She talked in depth about her nightmares. She explained what she thought it meant, that it was a warning of something known as the Crimson. She explained how the nightmare had been haunting her for the past week. Each time she fell asleep, the dream seemed to develop more and more detail. She explained how when her common sense screamed in her mind about danger, it was the scream of the girl in her dreams.
Who's the girl then?
Mike finally asked. Her nightmare was horrific, but Dawn had explained she'd never been there in her life. I found out she's me last night, she sighed. Except she's not quite me. She's like a reflection. She recalled the girl's speech. She wondered if it was really the Crimson that had attacked her home. Was she safe now she was gone? Her eyes drifted to Mike's hands. For a while the two sat in silence, until Mike broke the ice.
That's a lot to take in. You know that, right?
Mike told her, closing his eyes.
Living on the streets, it's not a picnic. This isn't a normal situation either.
He began tapping the wooden floor, letting out a deep sigh and slowly getting to his feet.
Well, get some sleep. We can think about it tomorrow, right?
She nodded as he smiled and placed a heavy blanket over her. She ducked her head under the blanket. It was cold in there, but it wasn't intolerable. Her eyes closed as Mike watched her. It didn't take much encouragement for her to fall asleep. Her blonde hair fell over her face. For that moment in time, she looked peaceful and content. Ricky entered the room and looked down at the two teens. Dawn looked no older than 12 or 13. Although he had given her a hard time, he was doing it to protect his friend.
I'm going to sleep near her tonight,
Mike told his friend. Ricky grunted in response. Mike was already becoming friendly towards her. It was a lonely life living rough on the streets. Ricky understood that, but she would cause nothing but trouble.
Don't get too attached,
Ricky warned him.
Once she's recovered, she's gone.